good afternoon, good evening, whatever it might be, wherever you might be. We're back. How are you this morning, Christos?
I'm good, man. I'm good. It's Monday.
Yeah.
It's a new week. It's a new day. We have a lot of exciting stuff this week. Chicken Man is first on the keyboard there to join us. Good morning, Chicken Man. Great to have you. And Bolt is here. Nice.
Bolt is
Some
back.
familiar faces. And
Good morning.
yeah, really excited, man. We have some really big projects happening this week internally. So unfortunately, I can't speak about them, but I feel excited.
Nice. We've got Mark here with us today. Good morning, Mark. How are you?
Hey everyone, how's it going? I'm doing well.
So
Good.
Or as well as can be expected being trapped in my house.
where about is home for you? Like I'm on the East Coast, and which coast
okay.
are you on? If you're on one.
I'm actually from the East Coast, so I
Yeah.
grew up in New Hampshire, but I'm over in the Pacific Northwest now, so I'm in
Okay.
the Redmond area.
Okay, so it's early for you then too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, oh, that's cool. Well, happy time zone, everybody. We're
Yeah.
So, did you do anything fun this weekend, Christos?
I did a stream yesterday, solo.
I noticed.
Somebody said, is that you like it was Richard saying, is that you splitting from NSYNC like Justin Timberlake did? Are you breaking up the group? I'm like, no, man, we are a team.
Only a matter of time.
I'm never going solo. There you go. I may be doing more solo streams in the coming weeks or months, but we're a team. So Monday and Friday is the de facto stream time unless they decide to change us. But me and JP are attached to the hip. There was a movie like that, wasn't there? At some
I
point.
don't know.
Yes, there was. Awful. Anyway, Mark is here, and he's here to talk about Terraform. And while we announced that, C# DevOps is saying good morning or good evening. I got a push notification with Terraform. See, people are using Terraform for many things. No, Chicken Man saying I missed the whole stream. Yeah.
So, what are you doing? What are you? Chicken Man asked if you're Justin Timberlake, who am I? I think that's exactly the point, right? Who can name anybody else from NSYNC? Was there anybody else? It might as well have been like Dave Matthews
That's tough,
Band, right?
man. So that's below the waist hits there, man. Yeah.
Well, but I mean,
True.
in some ways, it's kind of true too. So, anyway, so Mark,
V Murat is asking, what is Azure DevOps? We'll get into that in a bit, my friend. So thanks for asking. This whole show is about DevOps and Azure DevOps and Terraform. So stick with us and we'll get you up to date. Was Jon Snow in any of the music videos back then? No.
So Mark, so what do you do? What do you do here at Microsoft? What's your day job like?
I'm a program manager in the developer division at Microsoft. And what I work on, my focus is on Terraform. So Terraform is a product that is owned by HashiCorp, which is not a Microsoft company, obviously. And what it does is allow you to define and provision infrastructure. So you can define infrastructure as code and then deploy that infrastructure. And it can be to Azure, it can be to AWS or Google or any other cloud or even on-premise. So what my job is to make sure that Terraform works well with Azure. So I have an engineering team here at Microsoft that actually invests in the Azure RM and Azure AD providers to make sure that anything that you want to do on Azure, you can actually do through Terraform. So it's a fun job. It's in open source, which I have fallen in love with when I was back in working on the PowerShell team on desired state configuration. I started doing some DevOps stuff at that point and got introduced to open source and really fell in love with it and kind of made a move over to do that on a everyday basis.
Oh, very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, for people who are maybe unfamiliar, like I know there are lots of different ways to get an app deployed, right? You can right-click Publish in Visual Studio. You can, but obviously that doesn't scale. And there are things like Azure ARM, and then there's Azure now. ARM has like its own language on top as Bicep, and and there's Terraform. There are all these different ways to get an app sort of out the door. Like, what are all the different ways that we can get on an app? I mean, for someone, especially someone who's coming in new, it seems kind of confusing. There's so many different ways to do it, and I'm sure that no one way is particularly the best, right? Like, that would be completely subjective, but like, what kind of stuff is at your disposal, I guess?
Well, there are a whole bunch of different places that you could go with that question, but there are a whole bunch of different options from an infrastructure as code perspective. And most clouds or infrastructure pieces that you deal with have their own kind of infrastructure as code. And if people don't know what infrastructure as code is, it's essentially just codifying what you want your infrastructure to look like. So you have a document that says, I want 3 VMs, I want those VMs to have these hard disks, I want the networks to look like this, and so forth. There's just a way of defining that, like if you're doing JavaScript or something like that, but it's usually cloud unique. So Azure has one, Google has their own, I think, AWS has theirs. So it's typically, for most of those clouds, it's a big fat JSON document that you define, and it's unique. But there are other options. You can use scripting languages, so you can use PowerShell to actually provision infrastructure. So if you're familiar with PowerShell and used to using that, you can use that to deploy your infrastructure, and that has the benefit of actually working across clouds as well, or on-prem. And then there are tools like Terraform that were created specifically for infrastructure as code. So PowerShell is incredibly powerful. Kind of says that in the name, but it was not built specifically for infrastructure as code. It was built as essentially an alternative to Bash. So you can end up doing infrastructure as code, but it wasn't built for that. But Terraform is one of those tools that was built specifically for infrastructure as code, and it lets you define that, and it lets you go cross-cloud and all that kind of stuff too. So
how like I remember back in the day I would mess with Ceph and Puppet, which were probably the predecessors or precursors of the newer tools.
Yeah.
How important is infrastructure as code these days?
I think it is critical. So Puppet and Chef and desired state configuration, which I worked on when I was on the PowerShell team, were kind of a stepping stone to getting to where we are now. Those were considered configuration as code, and that was more of a, after I have my infrastructure up and running, how do I configure my systems so that I can run my apps on them? So how do I get SQL installed on this VM? How do I configure SQL so it has the right policies and tables and all of that kind of stuff? That's what configuration as code was used for. And most of the time for those tools, you needed a target. So I need a thing for my agent to run on or something to point at or what have you. Where infrastructure as code kind of brings it out one more level, where I don't have a system that I need to be pointing at per se. I don't have a VM that exists yet. I don't have a network that exists yet. I just want to define what this is and throw it at something like a cloud and tell it to actually provision that stuff. And as far as the importance of it, I think for companies to be able to reliably deploy infrastructure as code is completely critical. One of the things that I used to run into a long time ago, I've been in the management space for way too long, but a lot of the issues that customers used to have is that issue of something blew up on my network, and then executives come to you and go, what happened? And the IT folks are like, give me a couple of days and I will go investigate and figure out what happened. Where with infrastructure as code, you have something to point at directly because you have code. So I can point at my Git repo and say, I can see exactly what changed, and then you can go revert that or what have you. So it gives you a very easy way to kind of roll those kinds of things back. And when you're defining those things, it just makes everything easier and smoother and faster.
So what's sort of like, because I know if we look at like scripting, right? And I imagine as you had worked on Desire State Config in the past, you've probably got an opinion on this, but you know, I remember scripting things years and years and years ago, where this scripting was kind of the way to do it. It was what you had. Like this was back in like the manage.windowsazure.com days, and if you needed to do something, you essentially had to either review the state yourself to figure out what state all your resources were in, or just blow everything away and start fresh every single time. And I have a feeling we're in a much better place now than we used to be in terms of figuring out what to do. So what you kind of give us an overview of what that looks like?
Well, I think what Desire State configuration and ARM templates and Terraform and all of those kinds of things do is they provide best practices and structure around scripting. I mean, if you dive down into what happens under the hood with all of those things, it's essentially scripting anyway. But what they do is give you a normalized way to do things. So as an example, item potency. So most of these things have item potency integrated in them. So what item potency is if I have a script and I want to create a database, if to make it item potent, I need to check to see if that database is there first, and then create it if it's not there, and don't create it if it is there. Most of these things, DSC, Puppet, Chef, Terraform, all of those things have that kind of stuff built into it. And then other things like Terraform has the kind of the opinionated flow of having plans and applies, and apply is going to do a diff. So if I have a configuration that has 10 things in it, 8 of those things already exist. It's only going to make changes to 2 of those things. So it's that kind of stuff that's built into the tooling that you don't have to kind of script around and make sure that everybody that writes a script or edits a script actually creates those things as well.
So essentially, I've got the option, right? So if I want to plow everything over and start fresh, I can always do that. But if I've got 50 resources that are deployed and I've made an update to one of them, then that update's going to be applied to the one instead of me having to wait for all 50 or all 49 of the other resources that didn't change to change.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So what about when you're in a state where, say, we've deployed a template and it's out there and somebody went and made a last minute change in the portal, for example, or through script or something like that? Like, there's an emergency change or something and there's some config change made. Like, I imagine those would just get blown away in the case of redeploying a template, right? Because it didn't exist, but in the template, thus it shouldn't exist when it's out there, right?
Yeah, that is kind of the default behavior. Yeah.
Is there any way to sort of pull those back in? Like, I know that in Azure or in Azure we can generate a template which sort of kind of works to give us a template of ARM of an ARM representation. But is there any way to sort of pull those back in, especially looking at things like Terraform, to say, hey, I made a few changes. Can you generate a template from my thing, or can you look at the diff between the two and tell me what's changed?
Yeah, so Terraform has the concept of import. And what import does is exactly what you're talking about. So you can point at a resource and say, give me the state of that thing. And Terraform, in addition to the configuration, it actually maintains state. So the way that it knows the 2 machines that it needs to change is it keeps a local state that says the live environment looks like this, and I can do a comparison of the configuration with that state and see what I need to change. So the import will actually pull what's in the live environment into the state so that you can then rationalize that on that and then kind of apply things from there. And as far as the configuration, import doesn't update the configuration automatically, but it gives you the information so that you can actually add that to your configuration and then kind of do the apply from there.
Okay, cool. So do you have anything you want to show us? Anything you want to walk through or step through? Or
I do.
Nice.
I have a few things. So I'll start out with a little kind of introduction to our team and what we do and all of that kind of stuff, and then kind of dive into some DevOps stuff. So we haven't talked much about DevOps, but typically with infrastructure as code or even scripting and things like that, to make things repeatable, folks put them into pipelines. So automation, a way of kind of running them without having to say run every time. So in Azure, we have Azure DevOps, which is essentially a what used to be Visual Studio Team Services, and I don't even know what the name of it was before that. But it's a way of actually defining what your configuration is, how to run it, and all of that kind of stuff. So I'll walk through using Terraform with that, and kind of show you how to do that in a secure way.
all right, cool.
So is my screen being shared?
It is.
Perfect.
Yeah, it is
Yes.
now. Yep.
Awesome. All right, so I will go and see if I can find the screen. So I'll talk about, I mentioned earlier that we work with HashiCorp, or Terraform is a HashiCorp product. We actually work very closely with HashiCorp, and I'll talk about that in a second, but I'll talk about that and what our team does. So my team is a team called Azure Management Experience, and what our team owns is all of the command lines for Azure. So we own Terraform, like I've mentioned, so we own the Terraform integration into Azure. We own Azure PowerShell, we own Azure CLI, and we own Ansible as well. So essentially anything that you're going to use to provision infrastructure in Azure from the command line, our team owns. And what's really powerful about that is we treat not only kind of the first party PowerShell and CLI, but we treat Terraform and Ansible as first class Azure command line scripting, so that customers can use whatever suits them essentially. So if a customer is familiar with PowerShell and they want to use PowerShell, we're going to make PowerShell work for them so that they can be successful. If you use Terraform, like a lot of other customers, we're going to implement Terraform so that you can use it to do whatever you want to do on Azure.
So you mentioned all the tooling or the scripting tooling, but we do know that the portal is running off the APIs that we have, right? So
Yeah.
Is there at any point that we might have a disconnect, or are you guys usually ahead of what the UI displays in the portal in terms of functionality?
And that's a leading question, I think. Thanks for that, Christos.
Am I revealing secrets that we should be talking about?
No, so yeah, the UIs and things like that definitely do use the APIs, and there are requirements for the service teams. So for the service team to actually release a service or changes to service, they actually need to update that UI and update the APIs. My team actually owns the SDK as well, which is essentially the layer between the command line tools and the API. So that is generated for the different tools and all of that kind of stuff. But there is, especially with Terraform, there's a bit of a manual process to actually create the resources and things like that that know how to configure those things. And there is a delay there so when a service releases, that service team must release their ARM templates. They must release the UI when they go GA. There is a new process that we have in place as of essentially the last few months or so. That is requiring teams, and that would be my team from a Terraform perspective, to work with service teams. So service teams have to go through a process when they release a new service or a new feature. And we work with those teams when they go GA and make sure that they have Terraform support for them. So it is relatively new, but going forward, essentially when a service releases, they're going to have Terraform support, they're going to have CLI support, and they're going to have PowerShell support. So it is, we recognize that we are a little slower than the ARM templates and stuff like that, but we are going to be improving on that going forward.
Cool.
So ultimately, ultimately it's down to the service team, though, right? The team that's deploying the service, they're the ones who are ultimately responsible for what features they want to expose, especially like for new services and things, right? Which is why we see some services that are maybe more mature when it comes to scripting and automatic deployment versus others, especially for brand new things where it's kind of the basic. Does your team have any say in like what kinds of features or functionality need to be available, or is that all down to the shipping service team?
So the individual services themselves, they determine what features and functionality is released in their service. But how that is lit up in the command lines, we have some say in that. So it varies depending on the tool, if you will. So some teams, like the AKS team, consider the Azure CLI to be a critical component of AKS. So they own that, and when they release the Azure CLI as well. But my team owns the PowerShell piece of that, so they work with us, and we implement the PowerShell, and we do Terraform for all of the service teams.
Okay, cool. So that means that if my service doesn't have something available in script, I need to go complain to my service. I need to leave feedback for my service, not go put it in the Azure CLI repo and say, I can't do this with my service. It's ultimately down to the service to do it.
No, from the CLI like I said, it varies depending on service. So AKS owns their own Azure CLI, but other teams don't. Our central team does. So we have a central team that does Azure CLI. We have a central team that does Azure PowerShell, and we have a central team that does Terraform as well. So the best way of doing that, if you have an issue with PowerShell or Terraform or the CLI, is go to the GitHub repo and open an issue there, and then that team will either have the service team work on it or they'll work on it themselves. Okay.
We get that a lot of, I need to do blah, 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 but I can't find this property in the ARM template, or I can't find this in CLI sometimes, or whatever it might be. And so one more question as we're in the middle of this interruption to your presentation. So the generate ARM template from Azure thing that like I can't remember what it's called now in the portal, like export template or something similar. There are always certain things that it's like, I can't export this one specific thing or this one specific type or whatever. And I'm really curious, like how much do you have any insight into like how much people are using that, like that export template, or or how it kind of works, because it seems really interesting, and I've always been curious about it, and I don't know, it just seems like it's a really neat feature. I use it all the time, so I'm kind of curious just to learn more about it.
No, it is a neat feature, and I've been asked about it quite a bit from the perspective of Terraform. I do know that it is not perfect, as you guys mentioned early on. You can deploy your infrastructure and then say create an ARM template, and it works most of the time. But there are things that don't work, and I don't have any details about kind of how that works under the hood from an ARM template perspective. But like I said, I have heard it from a Terraform perspective, and even back to DSC. That's one of the things that kind of learning new infrastructure and kind of getting up to speed with new scripting languages and stuff like that is super helpful for customers to be able to kind of go to Azure, provision those things, and then say, make me some DSC or make me some Terraform or what have you. And that is something that we've thought about from a Terraform perspective, but we are essentially trying to get caught up on the coverage first. So.
Okay, cool. All right, sorry. Continue.
No. It's good. It's a good conversation. Good questions. So the way that we kind of work from a Terraform perspective is we have a partnership with HashiCorp. It goes all the way up. It's sponsored by the VPs and things like that in Azure. And like I mentioned before, I'm in I'm in the developer division, but I am essentially working with Azure on a day-to-day basis. I work with the service teams and all of that kind of stuff. So Brendan Burns over there is one of the sponsors, but it is something that we have recognized in Azure that is critical to many of our customers. So we are investing heavily in it to make sure that our customers can be successful in Azure. And we're doing that a number of different ways. So the partnership, we have a multi-year agreement with HashiCorp. So essentially my engineering team has a partner, a peer team, if you will, over at HashiCorp, and we work together on a regular basis. So HashiCorp has engineers, we have engineers, and we all work together on the Azure RM provider. And we work off a common backlog, and it's driven by any number of different things, be it, like I mentioned before, new services coming online or internal business things and stuff like that. So it's something that we work on together off a common backlog and kind of drive to full coverage. It releases on a weekly basis, which is kind of unique.
Nice.
When I'm working with service teams, they're like, well, how quickly can we get this out? And my response usually blows them away when I say, if we merge it, it'll be out on the next Thursday. So it's got a really quick cadence, and we are doing everything we can to kind of move faster and faster.
Do you get lots of contributions from enterprises? Like I remember in the past I worked with companies where they got stuck because something was not available yet, and what have you. What is the engagement of the community rather than us driving all the work? Do we get lots of contributions since it's open source?
That is a great point. Yes, we do have that virtual team between Microsoft and HashiCorp, but we do get a lot of community contributions. And then a lot of the time that the maintainers of the repo have is kind of reviewing those and working with those contributors and making sure that they have good high quality and tests and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, we do. We get a ton of community contributions, which is super helpful.
Yeah, so, great.
Yeah, especially in not only external customers, but we have a lot of folks within Microsoft that work with customers on a regular basis. And those folks, while they're working on a project with a customer, they'll actually see that something's missing and do a contribution and actually get that done that way too.
Sweet.
So, and one of the other things I like to point out, Terraform is a third-party product, but we do support it like we do ARM in Microsoft. So if someone has an issue while they're using Terraform, they can actually call support and get support with Terraform. And there's first level support where they'll go through and help you troubleshoot and all that kind of stuff. And if it is an issue in the provider or with the resources, they will escalate it to my team or HashiCorp or what have you. So it is it's something that we will back through and through from the top level all the way down to support. So.
You heard it here first, people. If you have issues, reach out. Mark is always open.
Yes. So kind of, this is a slide that I like to talk about from the perspective of Terraform future. Some of this stuff is in progress now. Some of this stuff is in the future, but essentially our goal with Terraform is to get to 100% coverage. So we want anything that you want to do in Terraform, anything that you want to do in Azure to be able to do through Terraform. We are making huge strides in that direction, and we are getting there and will get there. And additionally, we want not only to kind of catch up on the stuff that's missing, but we want to get to a point where any new service that comes out, and this is, I touched on this before, but we do have some processes in place now that when new services and new features and stuff come online, they have to go through those processes, and Terraform is one of those things that they need to do there. So that's something that's in process. And like I mentioned, the central team that we have working on Terraform is the same team that's working on Azure and CLI. And that carries a lot of weight because service teams understand the value of scripting and things like that. And that same team that they're talking to is included with Terraform and all that kind of stuff. So it is really a good thing to have all of that centralized. All right, so let's dive into Terraform with Azure DevOps. And I will touch on a couple of things here first, just to kind of introduce what I will be doing. So first of all, we have two, other than the Azure RM provider, we have two areas that we invest in, or my team invests in from an Azure DevOps perspective. We have an Azure DevOps provider. So A provider, and I don't have introduction slides in here or anything like that, but a provider is essentially a Terraform way of being able to configure different things. So it's a terrible way of explaining that, and I apologize, but so Terraform, like I mentioned, works against multiple clouds or on-prem or what have you, and the way that it does that is through providers. So a provider gives you a way of actually authenticating to the thing you want to configure, and then the logic about this is a VM, this is how you configure that VM, and things like that.
So before we jump in,
yeah.
People may be asking, what is Azure DevOps? Are you going to cover that later on, or is this a good point to cover it now?
I can show that here. Like
okay.
That's about, yeah. Why don't I just switch over to that screen?
So because we're good at confusing people with naming, right?
Yeah. But DevOps is a generic term, isn't it? It's a methodology. It's not a thing.
But we also have a product called Azure DevOps, and that's
we do.
Like you can do DevOps for Azure, and then you can do Azure DevOps. So what's the difference?
Yeah. So Azure DevOps is, like I mentioned, it's what used to be Visual Studio, team services. So it gives you a central place to have projects and boards and those kinds of things. So this is Azure DevOps in my instance, and I'm assuming you can see my screen here.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I have a project. It starts kind of.
Can you zoom in a little bit, like 2 clicks?
Okay.
Remember, I told you I'll be the voice of.
I know. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So you can have projects, and it essentially starts at the project level. And inside the project, you can have, or you have, a number of different things. And my clicking's not working. You have boards, and boards can have, like you track backlogs and things like that. So you can have issues and all of that kind of stuff in there. So you can actually do that first step of what is this thing going to look like. You can define the backlog, the work items, all of that kind of stuff, and track that, whether you're doing sprints or waterfall or any of that kind of stuff. You can define that and track kind of the flow of your project in there. You can actually have repositories. So you can have TFS repositories, or you can have Git repositories in there. So it gives you a place to store your code, either your application code or your infrastructure as code or what have you. So you can have those defined in there. You actually have external ones that are linked to this as well. There are a whole bunch of different options there. And then you can have pipelines, and pipelines give you a way of actually deploying your code. Typically a pipeline is used to build. So if you have a Java app, you can define how you need to build that Java app. And then you can have a release, which actually defines how you're going to actually release that Java app. So it gives you that automation around how I get this application from the raw code to actually provision to my environment. And then it has a whole bunch of other things like test plans and artifacts and compliance and stuff like that as well, that give you the ability to actually make sure that when I deploy this thing, is it actually what I expected to be out there? And artifacts give you a place to store your different artifacts, for lack of creativity in my words. So if I build a Java app, I can actually store that app so that I can roll back to it in the future if I want to. So it gives you all of that kind of stuff. One of the other things with pipelines that it gives you the ability to do is have different environments and things like that, which is super powerful when it comes to DevOps and deployments and stuff like that. So unlike the old days, if you will, environments allow you to define a dev environment, a test environment, and a kind of a prod environment. So you can actually use the same code and actually deploy to different environments so that you're sure that when it gets to production, it's actually a stable release and things like that. So it's a really powerful thing. So anything else on DevOps?
No, I think that's a great introduction. I'm not going to go on the Azure DevOps versus other tools, because there are lots of different other tools that you can use if you want to do your DevOps management, right?
Yeah.
So Azure DevOps is one of the offerings.
Yeah, it is. And I think one of the questions that I get a lot, and I don't know why I get it a lot because I'm not technically associated with Azure DevOps, but one of the questions I get is we've heard that Azure DevOps is going away and being replaced by GitHub Actions. And like I said, I'm not associated with it, but my understanding is it's not going anywhere. Azure DevOps and GitHub Actions are going to be around for a while. So choose your poison and use whichever one works for you.
Sure.
All right. So if I jump back here, so kind of two of the things that I want to talk about that my team owns related to Azure DevOps are the provider, like I mentioned. So we have a provider that allows you to actually, instead of going into this UI and saying, I want a new project, I want a pipeline, I want a board, and all of that kind of stuff, this provider allows you through Terraform to actually create those things and make them use infrastructure as code essentially to provision those things, which all the benefits that you get with infrastructure as code, being it is code, and you can roll back and all of that kind of stuff, you get with the Terraform provider here. My team owns that. We've released that as a Microsoft provider. So if you go into the registry.terraform.io, there is a DevOps provider in there, and I'll be actually using this for my demo. And you can see in here that there are resources for creating projects, for creating service endpoints and all of that kind of stuff, and build definitions and all of that. So it gives you that ability to define these things as Terraform code, check it in and roll back and all of that. So it's a pretty good thing. The other one is there are Terraform or Azure DevOps extensions. So what an extension is in Azure DevOps. I keep losing my mouse. In Azure DevOps pipelines. Actually, I'll go here.
And so, for those ones that may be watching the video later on, we'll have the comments down below on the comments. So not on the comments, on the description. So don't worry about if you don't get the links straight away.
So what an extension is allows you to have an easy way of actually doing something, a task in Azure DevOps. So if you have a build pipeline and you want to run Terraform, there are extensions. So if I come into the Visual Studio Marketplace and I search for Terraform, there are a whole bunch of different extensions here that you can use in Azure DevOps. And these allow you to do things like Terraform has the concept of plan and apply and init and all of that kind of stuff. These things give you that the infrastructure, for lack of it in other terms, but it gives you the ability to actually run Terraform within those build pipelines. So you can build your app and then you can kind of stand up your infrastructure in an easy way. So it gives you that. And this one from Charles Zip here is one of the ones, or the one that my team helps with. Charles put this together a little while ago and reached out to us. He's an internal guy at Microsoft, and he reached out to us to see if we could kind of maintain it going forward, and we are working with him on that. And I'll show you this as we kind of go through the demo, but it's super powerful and makes things easy. Like one of the problems that you have with using Terraform within Azure DevOps is getting the Terraform binary installed so that you can run it. This extension actually makes it easy. It allows you to pick which one you want and just installs it, and then you're up and running. So it actually makes it really easy.
And we need this one to, like, what is the minimum to run Terraform inside Azure DevOps? Just the extension or the provider?
Yep. No, just the extension. Yep.
So these are just add-ons if you want to do some extra functionality. You don't have to use these extensions, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So you could actually use a script and just run Terraform. But like I said, the issue with that is, where does Terraform come from? How do you get Terraform installed? So you'd have to have another task to actually install Terraform, and then you could run the script. Where this actually has all that stuff built into it.
Okay. Yeah, I get it. Cool.
All right. So let's kind of go back here. So those are the two kind of things that my team owns that we'll be using in this demo. And I'll kind of walk through. It's a pretty simple demo, but what I'm trying to do in this demo is one of the things that you will run into with Terraform, and especially when you try to automate it in pipelines, is almost anything that you do in infrastructure as code has secrets, so things that you don't want to expose. And using secrets in an automated pipeline like that can be tricky. So what I'm going to show is creating a pipeline where you can deploy MySQL with the admin username and password that are not exposed.
Right, and that's where secure DevOps comes into play, right? How do you secure your CI/CD pipeline? And because we had some comments before. Before you move on, do you want to answer a couple of questions?
Yeah, definitely.
There was one about, right, okay, let's see. AZ Wildfire is going on about, let me find the comment, ESLZ, which stands for Enterprise Scale Landing Zones. The question is this going to be supported? And there's also another question about Rover. I don't know what Rover is, but you probably know better than me.
I do. Actually, I have that I can kind of touch on afterwards, but
okay.
I work on a regular basis with the guys that own the Azure landing zones. And it is something that we are investing in heavily, both from a Microsoft perspective, and we've actually pulled HashiCorp into it as well, to make sure that we're not only doing Azure best practices, but Terraform best practices. So it is something that for folks that don't know what Azure Lander or the landing zones are, it's a I actually have a slide for it, but it's essentially a Azure best practice or a codification of Azure best practices for how to actually deploy in Azure for enterprises. So getting the understanding of what Terraform is not super complicated, but how to use Terraform in an enterprise where you have different teams doing things and all of that kind of stuff is something that it's not super straightforward, and the landing zones actually give you a way of actually doing that in a secure way. So
cool. And the Rover agent, like, does all these need Rover, or can we run these without the Rover agent?
No, you can do it without the Rover agent.
Okay.
What I will be showing if I get to that point.
Sorry.
No. I'm not. That's not what I mean at all. I mean, I have a ton of content to go over, so I'll probably touch on that. But the Rover just is something that the team built to do that kind of stuff to make things easier. So it uses Terraform under the hood, and Rover it's a container for one, and two, it's a tool that just makes it so you don't have to pass all the variables in and all that kind of stuff. It kind of puts another layer on top of that, if you will.
Okay. There is another question from Code with Sean. How can I trust an extension, especially not those created by Microsoft? Is there some kind of an onboarding process to the marketplace where we validate things?
So the Azure DevOps extensions? How can you test it? That's a great question. I don't, do you mean actually try it out and use it before you actually install it in your instance?
That's a good question. I suspect that the challenge here is like, how do I trust that the extension is not stealing credentials or is not doing something malicious, I guess. So is there a verified publisher kind of thing that if we say that something is by X person, we know that it is coming from X person or X company? And secondly, how do we know that it's not doing anything malicious in the code?
That's a great question. And yes, those things will be validated by Microsoft and made sure that they pass all of the Microsoft stringent security things and things like that. But also, I believe all of the extensions are open source. So they're out there on GitHub, and I think there are links out to where the source code is for those things. So you can just go out there and look at the code and review the code or what have you.
Oh, right. I see.
So
I
on
see.
here as the Git repo where those things are. And I'll zoom that in for you too. There's the Git repo.
Nice. Okay. There you go. So if you fear about intellectual property being stolen or credentials, then you can look into the source code. And I believe that Microsoft is also doing some validation on its end before it publishes those extensions in the marketplace. Like I think we do for the Azure AD marketplace, where we verify the publishers now and what
Yeah.
have you. Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Cool.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
No, I think that's it. It was rover, the landing zones, and extension security. So we're good to go with the demo.
Cool. All right. So what I have a couple of prerequisites here. I'm not gonna keep clicking. This presentation is hard. It's hard work here.
So sorry for making you sweat, man. Honestly.
So especially at, what is it, 8:30 in the morning?
Yeah.
I have a couple of prerequisites that I have set up here so that you don't have to watch me go through creating service principals and all of that kind of stuff. But a couple of those things are, I have an instance of Key Vault already provisioned. It's got some secrets in it already. So a couple of those things are an Azure tenant and subscription where I want to deploy this application to. I have the service principal password so that I don't need to think about what that is. It's secured in Key Vault. And then I have a couple of, or the GitHub personal access token so that I actually can pull the code from GitHub so that I can deploy it.
Right.
And then I have for the configuration itself, which I will show you later, I have the SQL admin and then the SQL password, SQL admin password. And that stuff's already put into Key Vault, which I'll be pulling into Terraform and using.
Right. So the first three bits are pipelining more or less, or setting up the task, and the last one is the stuff needed for deploying the resources.
Yeah, exactly. And so the two steps, and that's a good way of breaking that up because I broke it up into two steps here. The first step is to actually create the DevOps project and pipeline. And to do that, I will have two things that are kind of critical to making this secure. The first one is creating a service connection for the Azure subscription so that you can actually tell your Azure DevOps pipeline and it is allowed to deploy to that subscription. And the other one is creating a service connection to GitHub so that you actually pull the application code from GitHub to actually do the deploy. And the second bit is I'm going to run the job using the Terraform extension or the Azure DevOps Terraform extension to actually deploy SQL or MySQL to Azure. Make sense?
Absolutely.
All right.
I hope everyone's following on the stream, but for me, it makes sense.
Cool. All right. So let me kind of talk about some of the things. Again, I don't want you to watch me type all day long. So I have done a couple of things here. So I have Azure DevOps provider, and I've defined a couple of different providers that I need to run here. I have the Azure DevOps provider. That's the one that I mentioned to allow me to actually create projects and pipelines and all of that kind of stuff. I have the Azure RM provider, and that's the provider that defines what will be provisioned in Azure. So in this particular case, MySQL and those kinds of things. And then there's the Azure AD provider, and the Azure AD provider is used to create service principals and the like applications and whatnot. So I also have code already here because I want to focus on kind of the Azure DevOps and deploying that and kind of going through that. But I have some code that has been put together here already for kind of getting the secrets and whatnot. So I have a data source, and I haven't talked about this. Should I go into what the difference between a data source and a resource is in Terraform?
That would be nice. And also one-click zoom, please. Sorry.
No, don't. It's all good. All right. So let me go over here. So from a Terraform perspective, there are two concepts within the provider. There are data sources and resources. A data source is a way of getting information from something that already exists that you're not going to manage. So a good example of that that I'll be using here is service principals. So a lot of times customers have a team that is there to deploy service principals and apps and all of that kind of stuff, and then give those to app teams so that they can use those service principals in their deployment and stuff like that. A data source would be used to actually get that information, and then to be able to use that in your Terraform configuration. A resource is something that you manage, and you expect to be able to create, update, delete, and whatnot. Data sources can't be created, updated, or deleted. They're just information gathering. They're read-only, essentially. So in this secrets.tf, so if I step back here a second, so the way that Terraform works is when I run Terraform, it's going to look in the directory where I'm running Terraform and look for all files that have a .tf to it, and kind of compose those all together, and then build a configuration that it needs to run from there. So most of the time when customers create their configurations, they'll break up the TF files into logical groupings that make sense to them. So if they have a configuration for MySQL and a configuration for storage and a configuration for secrets or whatnot, they'll break those up into different files so that they can easily know where to go to look for that stuff, instead of having some big gigantic file that has all of the configuration in it. So I've done that on a kind of simple layer here. So I have a number of different data sources here. The first one is getting subscription information for my account that's logged in. And then I get the Key Vault. So the Key Vault instance that I have already deployed, I'm going to get a reference to that so that I can get the secrets from it. And then I get a couple of different secrets from that. I get the tenant ID, the subscription ID, and then I get the GitHub credentials, so the personal access token for GitHub.
Nice.
And then I get the ADO service principal password. So this is just a password that I've defined ahead of time that I will be using for the service principal. Nice. And then I'm going to go create kind of some of the secret stuff that I need to actually provision and create my pipeline in a secure way. The first one is an application. So an application is essentially just a service principal in a domain or in an area.
Oh, an app registration in Azure AD, right? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And then I'll create a service principal for that in my area, and then assign a password to that. So one of the things that's a little bit different in Terraform is the way that you get the password. So typically, if you've manually created a service principal in Azure before, you go in and create the service principal, and then it tells you what the password is by default. In Terraform, it's just an extra step where you actually define what that password is, so that you have that and you can store that or whatever. And you can see here that what I'm doing, I'm doing some referencing here. So I have my Azure application, my Azure AD application. I'm referencing that when I create the service principal. So it says I'm creating a service principal for this application. And then again, I reference that service principal and then assign the password that I got out of that data source. So that gives me my service principal that I'll then use in Azure DevOps for a service connection, essentially.
Right. So, but you also need a service principal to connect to Key Vault to begin with, right?
Yes. Yeah, and that's what I will do in my configuration itself. I'll give it permission. Actually,
right.
That's what I'm doing here.
So you have two different service principals. One to retrieve the Key Vault secrets, probably with a very locked down set of permissions, and then another one to do the deployment, I guess.
I'm actually using the same one for both.
Oh, okay.
Just for the simple example.
Sure. But I suspect that the best practice would be to split them out. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. So then you can see what I'm doing here is I have a role assignment. So I'm assigning for my subscription where I'm going to do the deployment. I'm actually giving that service principal contributor access to that subscription so it can create MySQL and those kinds of things. And then I'm creating another access policy for Key Vault so that service principal can actually access and get the secrets out of Key Vault. And I'm just giving it the get and list. And you'll notice here that I'm using an access policy That is because the Key Vault that I have provisioned doesn't have RBAC enabled. So if I were to have RBAC enabled on that, I would just create another role assignment and give it the Key Vault secret user preview permission there. So you might have that commented out here, but that would allow me to do that. Does that make sense so far?
Yes, it does.
All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually run this in a few different phases. So just kind of show Terraform running. So this is just the secrets. This is just going to provision that stuff. It's not going to do anything with ADO yet. It's just going to get the service principals and all that kind of stuff. So I'll do I have a shortcut here because I don't like typing.
Who does?
I'll do a Terraform init just to make sure that I have all the providers and everything. So what Terraform init does is it does primarily two things. If you're using any modules, it'll install modules, it'll install providers, and it does some basic syntax checking. So make sure that the data sources and resources that you're referencing in your configuration are actually valid and have the right properties and stuff like that. So I'll do that, and then I'll do a Terraform plan out, plan.out. This probably needs to be bigger too, doesn't it?
Yes, please.
Is that good?
I have all days.
I don't think it knows how to get bigger than that. All right, is that good? All right, so I'll do a Terraform plan. And what plan is going to do is it's going to take a look at the live environment and look and see what is in the live environment and what's in my configuration and what changes need to happen. So again, this is just on these data sources and resources for the service principals and whatnot. So that will just take a second here. And you notice one of the things that I did here was I did a Terraform plan and I did an out file. So what this does is creates a file that is exactly what my plan or what changes I'm going to make to the environment so that I can apply exactly that. So what that allows me to do is for myself or for someone else, I can send them the plan file and they can run Terraform apply and it'll run exactly what I had planned for. So if there are changes that are made behind the scenes, it'll give you some warnings about this is different than what is in the plan file and you can make a call on that. But it's a really good practice to actually go through and create that plan file.
So what about stuff like order of operations, for example? So like I can't add firewall rules to a SQL server if the SQL server doesn't exist, and I can't have a database without a SQL server, that sort of thing. I can't have a network security group without a, how does this figure it out for you, or is it sort of explicit? Okay.
So the plan does do that, and there are a couple of different ways that it does it. If you have a resource, you can see here that there's a reference to another resource in here. So when you create those references, Terraform says, this thing needs to be created before this thing is created. So that's kind of a implicit reference or connection, if you will, there. Yeah. Terraform also has a depends on.
Okay. Where
you can define and say, these are the other things that this thing depends on. So you can be explicit about, I don't have an implicit dependency, but I know that this thing needs to exist before I do that, so you can do that as well.
Yeah,
okay,
nice.
Cool.
So yeah, you can actually do, and I don't do it that often, so I don't remember the command off the top of my head, but you can do a Terraform graph, I think, which will actually build that dependency tree for you, so you can actually see what that dependency is. And you can look it up on the internet, but it's pretty straightforward.
Cool.
But you can see, if I can get my mouse back.
Can I ask a huge favor? If you're going to run the command line again, can you go full screen and zoom in as well? Some people can't see it. So this is not me telling you this time, saying it this time. It's somebody else.
That's all good. All right, full screen and zoom in some more.
Yes, please.
Ooh. I can even see this with my old eyes. All right. So what this output is it tells me exactly what it's going to perform. And you can see here, starting Terraform comes and says, this is a summary of what I'm going to do. So I'm going to create 5 things. If there was anything to change, it would say, give you some information in these details, but it needs to change something because, as an example, for Key Vault, I changed the name of the Key Vault or something like that, so it's going to change that. And then if it needs to destroy anything, it'll tell you that as well. And that's usually the one that gives people red flags if it needs to destroy anything. So I can see that there are 5 things that I want to do. So I'm going to go ahead and do a Terraform apply. Plan.out and apply that. And this should not take very long, but it'll create those service principals and role assignments for me. And I would show you that, but that's not super exciting. So unless you think it makes sense, I will do that. So we'll let that run, and I'll jump back to my code here. And man, this mouse thing is...
It's killing you.
It is. Come on. All right, so that's the secrets. I'm not going to save that because I just did the depends on. So now I want to jump into kind of how we get that project created and all of that kind of stuff. And let me know how we're doing on timing here.
Oh, you got plenty of time.
Okay.
Let us know if you want to take a break because we're at the top of the hour. So we usually take a break every hour for stretching legs and stuff and get some fresh air. So if you want to take a quick break, let us know, or we can pile through.
All right, let's get through a little bit of this here, and then we can take a break after that if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. So what I'm going to do here, and what I think is a typical process, so there is, we do have a language server for Terraform, so I have an extension in here that my team works with Terraform or HashiCorp on as well. So if you do something like resource, you get the automatic creation of those. It finds all of the resources that are available. So you can select those, and then you can have the properties and stuff like that. For some reason, the ADO provider doesn't get caught by the language server, so I will have to create a bug on my team on that for some reason. So what I'm going to be doing is essentially using what, if you don't have that extension, you would do anyway. So I'm going to be coming into the documentation, looking at the examples and kind of using that as a starting point for actually building out my configuration. So I'm first going to create a project, and that is this top level thing in Azure DevOps. So if I come back here, my first project is a project that will contain boards and pipelines and all of that kind of stuff. So I'll go ahead and create that and call that 4525 show, and just give it a 42 show proj. And I'll create a private. You can either have a private or a public visibility. So public, anybody can see it. Private is just within your organization. I'm going to use Git for version control and Agile for the template. Then you can come in and say that there are some of these things, like in this project, you can have boards and repos and all of that kind of stuff. If there's some of these things that you don't think you're going to use in the project, you can disable them so they just don't show up at all. Since I'm going to be using GitHub instead of the repos within Azure DevOps, I'm going to tell it to actually not use repositories as well.
Okay. Just one feature then, or just one bit of Azure DevOps? We're only using the one bit that we care about, right?
Yeah. So it'll just have the build pipelines that I'll be able to use to do that and some of the other stuff. So I'm just going to disable the test plans and artifacts and whatnot. So now if I save that and jump back here to my code, I will see that I have an error, which is awesome. one of the demo gods, as always.
No pressure.
Yeah.
We fail all the time, so don't worry about it.
Application. Huh. Interesting.
Is it it's a 403 unauthorized, so is the service principal different to the ones used before?
Let me see. No, it should be the same one. Oops.
403 is forbidden. Is it in the right? Does it have the right role?
Yeah. So.
The banking application of the service principal must be in the local tenant. So.
No, I think no, that's there. So the way that I am. Oh, yes, that is it. Thank you.
That's the only bit that we know here, the identity component.
Yeah.
Everything else is on you, but for us at least it's something that we can contribute to. So
yeah.
There you have it.
So just to give everyone an understanding, so what happens with Terraform is Terraform has a number of ways of authenticating. One of those ways is authenticating as myself, and since I'm running this from the command line, it's going to use Azure CLI to authenticate. And I think I just haven't, because I'm provisioning to, I may be authenticated to the wrong domain here. And I just need to switch it, or subscription. Sorry. Huh. No, it's actually connected to the right one. What was that?
Is it the correct tenant ID?
It should be, yeah, because I am connected to that, and then so it's not having an issue getting the data. Man, this mouse thing is going to kill me. It's not having an issue. This key vault is in that same tenant.
Do we know at which point of the call it failed?
I'll take a look when it runs again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I thought it said that I thought it said the service principal needed the service principal and the banking application need to be in the same tenant when it's single tenant, which leads me to believe that somewhere there's a tenant difference, but we'll look and see.
Oh, weird. How that worked.
Ah. Well, demo guys were giving us an opportunity to look into how things are set up.
Yeah.
There you go. People did say that it was done on purpose, so we can talk about identity since this is an identity.
There you go. Let me just double check to make sure that portal. Oops. See if that was created. The application. Okay. Yes, it was created. Now we have two of them. All right. So we have, sorry about that. We have that stuff created now, and apparently it worked, and hopefully it did. But let me go back here. I hope I'm not giving people headaches, but I'm flopping screens like that. But the ADO provider, so we have the project here, so the new 425 project, that's defined. And I will go back here and do, let me save that if I have not saved that, all right. So if I do a Terraform plan now, and out, plan.out, oh, yeah, it's a naming thing. So Terraform requires it to start with a letter.
Dev 45 show.
Yeah.
The one and only.
If I do a plan there, it should tell me that it just needs to create that one thing. And I don't know if you caught it or not, but what I've done here, like I mentioned, two of the things, or one of the key things that a provider does is authenticates to the thing that you're going to configure. And using CLI for the Azure RM provider is how I authenticate to create the service principals and all of that kind of stuff. I'm doing it as myself. But the Azure AD provider doesn't work that way. It has a different type of authentication, and you guys probably understand that better than I do. But what I've done there is I've created a environment variable that points to the organization that I want to configure, and I have I think it is an ID, so my essentially the same thing as a personal access token in GitHub. So I've created that in the organization so that I can actually configure that using that. So if I export here, it's probably a bad idea, but you can see there are a couple of AZ personal access token, and I will delete that when I'm done with this. But you can see those defined there, so that's going to use that as a way to actually configure that organization. So you can see, or you could see here from the plan, that when I created that, it's going to create the one project. So there's just one thing that's going to add. It's not going to delete anything. It's just going to create that project. So, oops. I will go ahead and do a apply and apply that, and let that run and do that. That happens pretty quickly. I think it's 10-15 seconds or so, so you'll be able to see that here real quick. Any questions?
This is going to create our DevOps project that we're going to use for, code or whatever later on for actually deploying apps somewhere, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So now if I come back to my Azure DevOps here and refresh this, you'll now see two projects. So you see the 425 show project and my first project. And if I come into this guy, you'll see that some of the things that I wanted disabled there are gone. So I don't have the artifacts, I don't have the testing and stuff like that. I just have the pipelines and boards and those kinds of things.
Very nice.
So who's the owner of this or of this project now? Like, is it you or
it's me,
the service principal? Okay. Did you set that somewhere explicitly?
In
your template, or
I think.
Is it because it's using your?
It's because
your
it's using
PAT?
My PAT, yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. So you created service principals for the purposes of connecting to Key Vault, where your PAT was?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So you put your PAT into Key Vault, Terraform then goes and connects to Key Vault as itself via the service principal, and then that's what talks to, that's what goes and talks to DevOps to do the actual work.
It's a little bit different. That was the environment variables that I had here. I had my PAT for connecting to ADO in that. And the reason for that is it needs to authenticate first. So it does all of the authentication to all of the providers before it even does anything else. So you have to have that ahead of time.
There's a question from Ewert and Crazy. Why choose Terraform over PowerShell with AZ module and Azure CLI?
That is a great question. And my answer is you don't have to. And it's one of the things that I really like about the team that I'm on now, is that my team actually owns AZ PowerShell and CLI and Terraform, and the whole reason for that is if you're an avid PowerShell user, go use PowerShell. If you're comfortable with it, that's great. If you want to use Terraform, go use Terraform. From a personal perspective, Terraform was built for infrastructure as code. It doesn't do anything else. That's all it does is infrastructure as code. So it's really, really good at that. It has those plan functions and all of that kind of stuff. So you really know what it's going to do. PowerShell is an all-purpose tool. So you can do that with the AZ module, and it does it well. And if you're comfortable with it, great. Go do that. But if you want something that is built for infrastructure as code, Terraform is a little bit better suited for it.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. So what's next? Oops. Come here. And what I am going to do now is I'm going to create those service principal endpoints. And I think what I'm going to do, so that this goes a little bit quicker, is I have a configuration that I have built already, and I know it works. So I'm going to actually just copy some of these things and talk about them, and then we'll kind of go from there. So that'll prevent me or you from having to see me type and what have you.
Is this a good time for everybody to take a quick break? I think
sure.
Everybody can use 2 or 3 minutes
Cool.
to freshen up, and then we're back. Get your coffee,
Sounds
get
good.
your drinks, tea, whatever you want, and then join us in a couple of minutes.
Awesome.
So
Hope
what's up
everybody
on?
filled their coffee.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have the jitters from my coffee.
I have a whole pod here. It usually goes in 3 hours, right? That's how I start my day. But man, I agree. That's why I'm switching to water in a bit. You changed the break song.
I will be doing the same. Yeah.
JP, did you change the break song?
I did. I got so tired of all the complaints. I thought, well, fine. I've got a 59-minute loop we'll use.
Nice, love it. There you go. That was a nice surprise there, because people were like, 1 minute and 40 seconds is not enough for a break. There you go. So someone's missing the old song now. You know, you can't have everything, guys. You can't have the whole pie. Damn, man. Okay.
I think I've got another version somewhere we can use. So.
Okay, there you go. Taking requests. Send us your requests.
That's
Right. Let's do some coding.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So just before the break, I posted a couple of new resources in here. The 2 resources I put in here are service connections. So these are 2 service connections that let me actually connect to Azure. So it uses the service principal that we created, and the password for that service principal that I had stored in Azure in the Key Vault. And then it has the tenant and stuff like that I'm actually going to be deploying this stuff to. So this is the way that Azure DevOps pipelines will actually be authenticated to deploy MySQL to the subscription where I want it deployed. And you can have any number of these things for different subscriptions or what have you. And the other one is a GitHub service connection. And that is where I'm going to pull the code, because I have the code in GitHub. I don't have it in the repository in Azure DevOps itself. I could do that and wouldn't need that service principal, but I thought it would be more interesting because GitHub is used by everybody to actually use that instead.
Does GitHub have the notion of service principals, or is that more of a service account or an access account for GitHub?
Personal access token. There may be another
Right.
way to do it, but I know this works. You just
Okay.
create an access token for yourself, and then it can actually check out the stuff as yourself.
So you don't need to use a pad. So you're not using a pad. Is that what you're saying right now?
I am using a Pat.
Oh, you're using a pad. Okay.
Yeah. All right. So I will go ahead and save that, and then go back here and do the TF plan again with And I may, because this is demo, what did I do?
So while this one is running,
different name.
Sorry. Okay,
No,
go for it.
go ahead.
One of the reasons why I reached out to you to begin with back in, I don't know, November now, October, was the backplane. Are you using a backplane to store the plan, or is everything running locally for now on your machine?
I'm running it locally.
Okay.
At the very end, I'll talk about the landing zone stuff and how that stuff
Right.
should work from the best practices.
Okay.
But I'm just doing it locally from a simplistic perspective.
Sorry for jumping ahead.
Well, actually, there are two pieces. So for the deployment of the pipeline and stuff like that, I am using a local state. So you can actually see in the directory here, the state gets created.
Right.
So when I deploy the app from GitHub, from the pipelines, I'll talk about it's actually using a backend, and that's one of the other thing that's built into that extension. You can actually create that backend and do all of that stuff automatically. So it is a really, really powerful extension.
Yeah, because GitHub doesn't have that one, so you have to configure yourself, correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So what the problem was there is I have a different name for my project here, so I just need to put that down here. And I'll have to remember to do it when I copy the other stuff over. So I'll make sure I saved back here and plan out. Oh my goodness. Okay, that's just another naming thing. Where's this one? Oh, it's a copy paste. That's what happens when you just 425 show. And I am going to be a really bad Terraform user and just go straight to the apply.
Nice.
And just so people know, what happens when you do the apply without a plan is it actually does a plan as part of the apply. And then we'll ask you to confirm. So it actually does that a plan. It'll give you the synopsis of what it's going to do, and then make you confirm and say, yes, I want to do this. And again, for demo purposes, this is fine. But in the real world, you definitely should use plan and the file out.
So this is more of a YOLO thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. DT in the cloud is saying today's show just gave me a new to-do for 2021, testing or checking the ADO provider for Terraform.
Cool. And it is, it gives you that, what I like about the ADO provider and the ADO extension is it gives you that full life cycle, if you will. So you can stand up the pipelines with Terraform that actually run Terraform to deploy your applications. And it gives you kind of that full, everything is codified to actually do all of that stuff, which I think is really cool. So you can see here, those two endpoints will be created. All I have to do is come in here and say yes, and it will create those two endpoints or connections. So while that's doing that, I'll pull the next thing in here and talk about what that is doing. So the next thing is with those service principals, or I'm sorry, with the service connections, I need to give those service connections access to stuff in Azure DevOps. So in order for those service connections to have access to my pipeline, I need to say that they have access to my pipeline. So I will copy those and lose my pointer again. And paste that in here. And then make sure I have the names correct. Any demos should be 425, oops. 425 show. And 425 show. And I'll save that. All right, so coming back here, you can see that the apply happened. So I should have those service connections. So if we go back to my project here, for my 425 show project, I'm going to the project settings. And if I come down to, where is it? Service connections here. You'll be able to see that I now have those two service connections. So I have my service connection to Azure, and I have my service connection to GitHub. All right, so let's authorize those so that they can have access to the pipeline, and then I can get on to deploying my application. So I'll just do that TF apply again. Project 425 show, what is wrong with that? Oh, show 425. All right, save that again. And as you can see, errors actually have good explanations in Terraform, which is kind of good.
Yeah, so there's nothing worse than getting an inconspicuous error message that you can't decipher.
Yeah. I unfortunately am showing you a little too often, I think. All right, while that's doing that, what I will talk about and do next is the whole goal of this is to actually deploy an application. Well, kind of an application, kind of the infrastructure for an application. And I have a configuration that I've already put together for that application. And that is in GitHub. So if I come out here in my personal repo, I have that application code already out there and deployed. So a couple of things that I'll point out there. So I have my Terraform configuration, and I have the pipeline YAML. So in Azure DevOps, you can define the pipeline, so what you want the pipeline to do in a YAML file. And I will not get into the details of that per se, but essentially this is everything that you want your pipeline to do. So it's the different steps and the different tasks to happen. And what I will kind of touch on here is these steps or these tasks are using the Azure DevOps extension that I mentioned before. So it's the Charles Zip extension. And the way that it works is there are two tasks, I think, in the extension. There's one for installing Terraform, and then there's one for doing any kind of command line operations. And it really simplifies that whole process. So I have the two here. The first one is the install Terraform. So I pick the version that I want to install, and it'll make sure that that's installed. The next one is an init, and that is going to do, like I mentioned before, that'll initialize Terraform and get everything, all the providers and modules and everything pulled down. The other thing that this does is it allows you to say, I want to use Azure RM as a backend. And give you the permission or give the information about the storage account and those kinds of things. And it will go create that backend, get it all ready for you, and then start saving the state in there. So it gives you a really easy way of using the Azure backend. And what that is a really important point with Terraform, because the state, like I mentioned, stores the information about your configuration. And that configuration can include secrets and all of that kind of stuff. So this gives you that centralized, secure way of actually storing that backend without keeping it on your local system that multiple users in your project can actually use. So it initiates that and makes that super easy. And by default, nobody has access to this except for the account that's set up in Pipelines. So Pipelines created that. It has access to it. Me as a user, I don't have access to that, so I can't go look in that state and see what's in there. The service principal can. So it is
is the Charles Zip extension creating that for you when you define these things? Nice. Okay.
Yeah. So obviously you have the permissions that will trickle down from subscriptions and stuff like that. So those things will have access, but you can control that as well using the Terraform or Azure RM extension. You could actually control that as well.
Right. Thank you. That's super useful.
And the next two things that I have is just a plan and apply. So it's going to run the plan for the configuration that I have defined here, and then the apply. And the configuration is pretty simple. It's just creating a resource group in my Terraform or my Azure subscription, and then it'll create a MySQL server, and it'll use from the key vault. It will use the admin user that I defined in there, and then the password. So, and those won't be shown, those are secrets. So in my plan, those are not going to be shown up as clear values. They're just going to be stored in state. Then I can define all the other stuff about MySQL, and then I can create a database for that as well.
Very nice.
All right, so let's go back here. Shoot, now say yes. So that'll go and create those authorizations. That should happen super quickly here. And then I'll go back here. And the last thing that I will do in my Azure DevOps is actually create that pipeline. So this is the last resource for actually creating that build pipeline. And I'll add that here and talk about that. So the last step here is the build pipeline, and I will do this correctly. Show 425. It'll create a new build pipeline with a name, and it's going to do two things here. So it's going to set it up so if I make a change in GitHub, it will automatically trigger and trigger based on what's defined in the YAML. So that if I make a change to my configuration in Terraform, it will automatically trigger and redeploy that thing. And it sets up the repository itself. So it tells Azure DevOps where that repository is. And as you can see, it's in my personal repo, and it's the app config. And then it tells you what branch it wants to trigger off of. So you can do it off all branches or main branch or what have you. And then it points at that build YAML. So it says, go look at this to figure out what this pipeline should look like. That all make sense?
Yeah, it does.
All right. So that stuff was created. And then I just need to go ahead and save this and come back here and do another apply. And this should actually build that build pipeline. Any questions while that's happening that are coming up?
I think people are just following along, so we don't have any new questions so far. People are talking about the weather as they follow along. But no, it's going well.
Cool. Good. All right. So this should be pretty quick here, and then I'll jump back and show you that this thing was created in the pipeline. Then we'll go ahead and run it. And if we want, we can actually make a change to the configuration on GitHub and watch it actually get triggered again.
So that will be the continuous integration, right? Or
Yep. Yeah.
Yep. So then the nice thing about what you've shown so far is that we are building quite a bit of the pipelining and the deployment, and we have no secrets whatsoever in any of the files, and that's the important bit.
Yeah, exactly.
There are a couple of environmental variables, but nothing that could be used to compromise the system, correct?
Yep, that is correct.
Perfect. And that's the important bit there, secure DevOps.
Yeah. All right, so that is deployed. So if I go back to my project here, jump back here, you'll be able to see in my pipelines. I now have a 425 show build. It's never been run. And if you come in here, what I find really interesting about this, if I come in to edit this pipeline, I don't have access to actually edit it because the service principal is actually authenticated to actually get that configuration and run it. So as a user, I can be authenticated to run it, but not even see them change the configuration. I have to go through GitHub to actually change that build pipeline and stuff like that, which is pretty cool.
There's a question, by the way.
Yep.
Is there a way to visually represent the workflow for Terraform? Are there any tools that can do that kind of a visual workflow rather than all scripted? Do you know?
For the Terraform code itself or the extension YAML?
That's a good question. Josh Nunath asked that. So let's say either or both. I don't know. Is there any tools?
So for the extension YAML, what I do to get used to it is when you create, I'll go back to my other project here. Oops, let's go back to the same project. If I come to my first project here, you can actually use the UI here. So if I go pipeline, if I want to create a new pipeline, you can come and say use classic editor here. And you can choose, I'm just gonna use that because I don't care. You can use an empty pipeline here down at the bottom. Apply, oops. And then in here, you can actually add the Terraform tasks. So as a job here, I can add a task. And go to, actually, here's the filter. Here it is, Terraform. So you can use the Terraform installer and CLI. So you can add those and actually see what the configuration looks like here. So you can actually define that. Okay. And then you can actually come back here and export the YAML to save it to code if you want to. So you can actually use this as a UI to get familiar with that.
Ah, nice.
For Terraform itself, there really isn't anything that I'm aware of to visualize the configuration. It really, that's kind of goes back to that export ARM template stuff that we were talking about earlier on. That's why customers want to do that typically. But when it comes to the Terraform syntax itself, because it is essentially exactly what you would see in a UI, that's a property and a value, coming to the documentation is really the best place to come for that. But.
Thank you. That makes sense. Yeah.
All right, so let's go back to my pipeline here. Yes, I want to leave the 425 show. And let's go run that pipeline so that we can see. And I'll show you before I do that, so that you can see I don't have anything under my sleeves or in my sleeves or what have you. Resource groups. Call it AME. What did I call that? So that's a good thing that nothing's showing up. So in my configuration, I have a 425 demo. So the resource group name is going to be 425 demo app. So if I come back here, there's nothing exists. Resource group doesn't exist. MySQL doesn't exist. So nothing's there. So if I come back to my pipelines and go in here, I should be able to just run the pipeline. And I'll show you a couple of things while it's doing this. So you can set some variables or whatnot in here if you want, but you just go ahead and run. And that will run that pipeline. And you can actually jump into the pipeline and see the progress, which is really nice. It gives you the output from Terraform and init and all of that kind of stuff. So it gives you that live. So the first couple of steps is just going to be pulling the code or setting up the machine that it's going to run on. Pulling the code down onto that machine, and then it'll go into the things that I defined in the pipeline itself. So it installs Terraform, the version that I want. It does an init on that, and then it'll do a plan and apply. And you can see all of that in the output here, as well as afterwards you can go back to the pipeline and see that as well. That's good. And one of the things that you could do is you could have a different job here. So you could have a job that stops at plan. So you have a plan, output the plan for that, and then have another job for the apply, and then have a dependency that basically says if anything fails in this plan, don't continue with the apply.
Is that where you would also use the approval process? As
Yeah,
in,
exactly.
somebody needs to come and approve that the plan is what it's supposed to do and gets a sign off?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So, and you could do that in a manual way, or you could probably do that in some sort of testing way. You could have a script that actually parses the output and sees that it is what you expect or what have you. So, but it gives you that ability to do that. So this is going through and creating the resource group, and then it's going to deploy MySQL.
Is there a what if? I know PowerShell, for example, when you're running with ARM templates, you can do a what if. I know you can do incremental and complete and test only deployments with ARM. Does Terraform have something similar? Because Josh Nunatha is asking again whether there's a what if for Terraform.
There's not a what if per se, but plan essentially is the what if. So the plan looks at what is in the live environment and looks at what's in your configuration and says, this is what I need to do to make the live environment look like your configuration.
Right.
So.
Okay, I see that. Because PowerShell doesn't have an intermediate step. It's either you run it or you don't run it. Whereas with Terraform, you create a plan first before you apply the plan.
Yeah.
So the plan is your diff, if you,
exactly.
if you want. Okay, cool.
Yeah. This, I think, only takes a minute or so. So
what are the states that we're applying the plan now, right?
it's actually applying, yes. So it's actually, if I zoom in here a little bit.
At the point of no return.
Yeah, and if I actually go back to, get my cursor back here somehow, and refresh here, you should be able to see the resource group. So the 425 show resource group. So this is the resource group where the app's being deployed. And the 425 show shared is actually the resource group where the backend, so the state is stored. So that is actually created as part of that process as well. So that's where my state is. And then the application will be in here once it's done.
Again, Bolt.io is asking, is there a way to do a dry run with Terraform, which I think is what we answered before, right? You do the plan and the plan is your what if or dry run.
Yeah. And one of the other things that you can do and should do with Terraform is from a dry run specifically perspective, is you should have different environments. So you should have a test environment where you can actually deploy Terraform and make sure that it's in the state that you want it to be in. And then have a production environment after that. So you have those different phases in there where you can actually define those things in, I'm not going to go into that here, but you can define those things in Azure DevOps, where you can actually have it go through the flow where I'm going to deploy in a test environment so it's not hitting production, make sure that it's successful, and then use that same configuration in production to deploy. That way you're sure that what I deployed will work in production.
And as we do with ARM templates, for example, you can have a cookie cutter approach where your QA is, or your test is much smaller in terms of resources and size, so you don't spend a lot of money deploying these. And then in production, you do the actual tiers that you need to target. So that's a good approach. We have another question. Hope you're okay with that. Can DevOps create tickets for the items that need to be added or modified before the actual run of the build or whatever? Like, is there a way to automate that?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I feel like there are plugins for ServiceNow where you could do that kind of thing, but I don't have any experience with it or anything.
Right.
So,
yeah. I mean, remember, DevOps can run any script that you have. So you could, in effect, create a PowerShell script or some .NET runtime command line tool that will go and execute whatever you want against whatever service, as long as there's an API you can connect. So if there's no automation, you can build it yourself, to be honest.
Yep. All right, so that looks like it ran successfully. So let's go back here and refresh this. And I should see my
resources.
My MySQL. Where am I? Cost management. How did I get there? Oh, that's how. I'm in the wrong spot. All right, so refresh this guy. All right, so now I have my database. It's a MySQL database. It's deployed with the secrets. Nothing was exposed in code, and it's there successfully. All right, so if we want to see this CI here real quick, I can kind of brute force this and go in and make a quick change here. In my code, if I want to change, I don't know the SKUs off the top of my head, but I just want to change the name here to 2 of my resource, and I can commit the changes. And being a horrible dev, I'm not putting any comments in the commit message.
It's okay. We'll let it fly for this time.
So if I come back to my project here, oops, going to the wrong spot. All right. If I come back here to show build, you should see a second kickoff here. So I just made a change to GitHub. I mean, it's going to go through and run that configuration again. So you can see that it's actually running that in process, actually. So it's going to go through that whole thing again. And it's actually, once it gets that stuff installed, you'll see that because I made a change to the resource itself, it's going to need to delete the other resource, the other MySQL database, and create a new one. So you don't need to wait for all of that, but once you see this in here, I'll kind of show you that summary of what it's going to tell you it needs to do. I jump back to the plan here, you'll see that it needs to create a new database. So it's going to go through and do that.
Nice.
Cool.
Integration and deployment.
Yeah. The apply failed. But let's just wave our hands and say that it didn't happen. So I don't want to fix it.
True.
All right. Cool. So that is kind of that full end-to-end of Terraform, using Terraform to spin up Azure DevOps project and pipeline, and actually deploying the infrastructure for an application using that pipeline in a secure manner.
That was great, Mark. Thanks for coming and showing us how to set it up and get started. We will include the documentation in the description below, links to all the extensions that we talked about and all the questions that you asked that we can link to. Cool. Thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you, guys. I do want to just real quickly here touch on, so that people actually can see it and go look at it and things like that. But there's a lot of work being done around Terraform and landing zones and cloud adoption framework. And what this is essentially a methodology for moving to the cloud. And the landing zones are the codification of that. So they're Azure best practices and Terraform best practices all wrapped up so that you can use those in your deployment. And I think one of the things that is most powerful from my perspective, those are just the different components. But in the real world, you're never in an environment where there's one guy that does everything, or if you are, I'm sorry. But typically you're in an environment where you have different, you have somebody that owns kind of the policies and things like that, another team that owns the networking, another team that owns the application, another team that owns Kubernetes. And this gives you that infrastructure and the best practices around how to work in that kind of environment. So we talked about the Terraform state. Working off of one big state file for all of those different teams is not only not good practice, but would be really, really hard to do. So this landing zone stuff gives you kind of the way of working in those environments. So each of those different teams can have their own state file and be able to work with those state files and not have access to the other stuff, but be able to read and be able to use the information from those things. And the way that it does it is through different levels. So you can have or it has different levels defined, which have their own state file, which those teams can be given access to and things like that. So it's a really prescriptive way of actually using Terraform at that scale, that enterprise scale level, which is really helpful for a lot of customers. So.
Yeah, I can see how that would be useful, especially for large organizations where you don't own the full end-to-end experience.
Yeah.
Cool. That takes us to top of the hour, which is great. JP, are we going to carry on with something else later on, or are we calling it a day?
I don't know. I have a bot that I have to build that everybody complains about. We'll probably. I don't know. I might pick it up later in the week. So what do we have going on the rest of this week? We're going to be doing Go on Friday, right?
We're doing Go on Friday. We have Tulsa user group with Sean that we're speaking at on Thursday. We have tomorrow's Learn TV. So join us at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning to continue our journey into learning about identity, very general stuff. And it's going to be a busy week.
Yep. So we will see you. I guess we'll see everybody tomorrow at 11 Eastern, 8 Pacific, or again on Friday, or come to Code with Sean's Tulsa Developers Meetup. User group.
We'll be there.
Yeah, and we'll be there. If you watch the show frequently, you may hear things that you already heard, but that's okay. You can just heckle us from afar. No different than normal, really. Join the Discord. We got a bunch of stuff going on over there. Join the Discord. Come and hang out. I added a thing to make a a bang Discord, so you can go join it. Here it is in the chat. Go join the Discord. Come hang out with us. Get your questions answered. Send us email at 425show@microsoft.com. And we will see you all tomorrow, Thursday, and next week or Friday. See ya.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.